Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now, let's step inside. What it takes to be transferred to ADX Florence, America's most isolated prison. There are prisons in America designed to punish, prisons designed to rehabilitate, and prisons designed simply to hold people until time runs out. But there is one category of prison that exists for a very different reason. A place not meant to correct behavior, not meant to prepare anyone for release, and not even meant to be seen by the public. ADX Florence does not begin with concrete walls or steel doors. It begins months or years earlier, inside quiet meetings, internal reports, and decisions that are never announced out loud. No one wakes up one morning and is suddenly sent to America's most isolated prison. A transfer to ADX Florence is not a reaction. It is a conclusion. Before a person is ever moved, before restraints are applied, before transport is scheduled, the system has already decided something important, that the prison they are currently in is no longer enough. This documentary is not about what daily life is like inside ADX Florence. It is not about cells, silence, or routines. This is about the moment before all of that begins. Because the most powerful part of the transfer process is not the journey. It is a judgment that makes the journey unavoidable. Inside the American prison system, thousands of inmates are classified, monitored, and evaluated every single day. Their behavior is logged. Their interactions are tracked. Their compliance or resistance is quietly measured. Most of these evaluations lead nowhere. Some result in transfers to higher security units. But a very small number of cases follow a different path. A path where the question stops being, can this inmate be managed? And becomes, where can they no longer affect anyone else? That is when ADX Florence enters the conversation. But here's what most people never realize. The decision to send someone to a Supermax facility is rarely about a single incident. It is about patterns, accumulation, escalation, and something prison administrators call institutional exhaustion, the moment when every other option has been tried, documented, reviewed, and rejected. ADX Florence is not used to punish anger. It is used to contain influence. The system watches for inmates who disrupt structure rather than break rules. People who do not simply disobey orders, but undermine the authority of the institution itself. Individuals whose presence creates instability that cannot be solved by segregation, discipline, or relocation within ordinary facilities. Long before a transfer is considered, a file begins to grow. It contains incident reports, but also long periods of silence, psychological assessments, but also staff observations, security notes, but also behavior that appears calm on the surface. What matters most is not how loud someone is. It is how persistent they are. And unlike most decisions in the criminal justice system, this one does not involve a judge, a jury, or a courtroom. It happens behind closed doors, inside a bureaucratic process that is slow, deliberate, and almost invisible to the outside world. Committees review case histories. Administrators debate risk levels. Federal officials weigh long-term containment against institutional capacity. At no point is the inmate asked for input, because by the time ADX Florence is discussed, the outcome is already leaning in one direction. What makes this process especially powerful is that it does not rely on emotion. It relies on documentation. Every step is written down. Every concern is justified. Every recommendation is supported by precedent. The system does not need urgency. It has time. And time is the most dangerous factor of all. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into reviews. Reviews turn into approvals. And somewhere in that process, a decision quietly hardens into policy. This documentary explores that invisible path, the warnings that come first, the thresholds that must be crossed, the internal logic that turns a regular prison sentence into something far more isolating. Because once the transfer is approved, there is no appeal that stops it, no public announcement, no dramatic moment, just a line added to file, and a future that has already been sealed. When a prison stops being enough, every prison sentence in America begins with a basic assumption that the institution holding the inmate has the tools to maintain control. Walls, schedules, discipline, separation, and supervision are all designed to manage behavior over time. For the vast majority of inmates, this assumption holds true. Even when problems arise, the system has layers of response built into it. Disciplinary segregation, loss of privileges, unit transfers, and increased supervision. But Chapter 1 begins at the point where that assumption quietly collapses. A prison does not fail in a dramatic way. There is no announcement, no emergency declaration, and no public acknowledgement that control is slipping. Instead, failure is recognized slowly through repetition. When the same problems appear again and again, despite different interventions, administrators begin to notice a pattern that discipline alone cannot correct. At this stage, the inmate is not necessarily violent. In fact, many of the individuals who eventually face Supermax consideration are outwardly calm. They follow basic rules. They understand procedure. They do not always draw attention to themselves. What separates them from the general population is not chaos, but influence. Prisons are systems built on predictability. Count times, movement schedules, work assignments, and controlled interactions are designed to reduce uncertainty. When an inmate consistently disrupts that predictability, not by breaking rules, but by bending them, the system takes notice. Staff begin documenting behavior that technically complies with policy, but produces instability inside housing units, work details, or staff operations. This is the earliest moment when a prison begins to feel insufficient. At first, the response is internal. Case managers adjust housing assignments. Supervisors increase monitoring. Psychological staff may conduct updated evaluations. Each step is framed as routine, not escalation. The goal is always correction, not removal. Administrators are trained to exhaust every internal option before considering external solutions. But over time, something changes. Incident reports start to reference previous interventions that did not achieve desired outcomes. Notes begin to include phrases like ongoing concern, continued pattern, and limited effectiveness of current controls. These are not dramatic accusations. They are administrative signals. Each one adds weight to a growing internal file. Importantly, this process is slow by design. A system that moves too quickly risks being challenged. Decisions that affect long-term confinement must appear reasonable, measured, and justified. That means every step must be documented, reviewed, and defensible. The system does not ask whether an inmate is dangerous in theory. It asks whether the institution can reliably manage that individual without compromising safety, order, or authority. When the answer becomes uncertain, escalation begins. This escalation does not look like punishment. It looks like assessment. Behavior is observed across different contexts: housing units, recreation periods, staff interactions, and response authority changes. An inmate who reacts unpredictably to staff rotation, resists informal compliance, or influences others without direct instruction may trigger concern. These behaviors are subtle, but prisons are highly sensitive environments. Small disruptions can ripple outward. Administrators understand that control is not just about stopping rule violations. It is about preventing them from spreading. As a result, an inmate may be moved within the facility, then to another institution of similar security level. Each transfer is an attempt to reset the environment. New staff, new routines, new expectations. If behavior stabilizes, the process ends there. The system considers that outcome a success. But when it does not, when patterns reappear regardless of location, the question changes. Instead of asking, how do we manage this inmate? The system begins asking, where does this behavior no longer matter? That is a critical shift. It marks the moment when prisons stop thinking in terms of rehabilitation or routine control and begin thinking in terms of containment. The goal is no longer adjustment. It is limitation. At this stage, administrators are not reacting to incidents. They are responding to persistence. A pattern that survives multiple environments suggests something deeper than situational conflict. It suggests that the inmate's presence itself creates strain on the institution. This is when higher-level reviews are triggered. Regional officials may request full institutional histories. Psychological assessments are re-examined, not to diagnose illness, but to evaluate adaptability. Security classifications are reviewed with an emphasis on long-term risk rather than short-term behavior. Each review adds another layer of confirmation. No single person makes this decision. It emerges from consensus. And by the time the idea of Supermax placement is raised, the file already tells a story, not of violence or chaos, but of a system that has tried, adjusted, reassigned, and documented its way to a conclusion. That conclusion is simple, but severe. This prison is no longer enough. And once that idea is accepted internally, the path forward narrows rapidly. The file that follows you everywhere. By the time a prison begins questioning whether it can still manage an inmate, the most important object in that person's life is no longer their cell, their housing unit, or even their sentence. It is their file. Every inmate in the American prison system has one, but most files remain thin, procedural, and largely forgotten. They contain intake documents, basic disciplinary records, and routine evaluations that rarely influence long-term decisions. But when an inmate enters a zone of serious administrative concern, the file changes purpose. It stops being a record of the past and becomes prediction of the future. This chapter focuses on that transformation. Once a pattern of concern is identified, documentation begins to intensify. Staff are instructed to be precise. Observations become more detailed. Reports no longer describe isolated incidents. They describe behavior over time. Language becomes careful, measured, and consistent, because every word may later be reviewed by people far removed from the original institution. This is not done out of suspicion. It is done out of necessity. The federal prison system relies on paperwork to justify decisions that cannot be reversed easily. Transfers to extreme levels of confinement must survive internal audits, legal scrutiny, and policy review. That means the file must speak clearly even when the original staff are no longer present to explain it. Small details begin to matter. How does the inmate respond to authority changes? Do they comply immediately or only after delay? Do they influence others indirectly rather than issuing commands? Do issues reappear after transfers meant to stabilize behavior? Each answer becomes part of the record. Importantly, these notes do not accuse. They describe. The language avoids emotion. Terms like non-compliant or threatening are used sparingly. Instead, phrases such as ongoing pattern, resistance to institutional controls, or limited responsiveness to intervention appear again and again. This language is intentional. It frames the issue not as misconduct, but as incompatibility with standard correctional environments. As the file grows, it begins to travel. Case managers share summaries with supervisors. Supervisors forward assessments to regional administrators. Psychological services contribute evaluations focused not on diagnosis, but on adaptability and stress response. Security staff add notes about institutional impact rather than individual rule breaking. What emerges is a composite image, not of who the inmate is, but of how the institution reacts to their presence. This distinction matters. The system is not trying to label someone as irredeemable. It is trying to answer a narrower question. Can this person be managed while consuming disproportionate resources or destabilizing others? If the answer remains uncertain, reviews escalate. Classification committees meet periodically to reassess custody levels. In most cases, these meetings are routine. But when a file shows repeated concerns across multiple facilities or units, those meetings take on a different tone. Members look for trends rather than incidents. They compare outcomes across environments. If similar problems appear in different places under different staff, the system begins to see the behavior as portable. That is a critical turning point. Portable behavior suggests that changing surroundings will not solve the issue. And once that conclusion is reached, the pool of acceptable placements shrinks rapidly. At this stage, administrators are not thinking about punishment. They are thinking about efficiency and control. A prison that must constantly adjust staffing, housing, or schedules around one individual is not operating as designed. The file begins to reflect this strain. Notes may reference increased staff attention, repeated interventions, or the need for specialized handling. These are subtle signals, but within the system, they are significant. They indicate that the inmate's presence is no longer neutral. It is costly. As the file accumulates, it becomes self-reinforcing. Each new entry is read in the context of everything that came before it. Past concerns give weight to current observations. Current observations validate past concerns. Over time, the narrative solidifies. By the time higher-level administrators review the case, they are not reading a series of isolated events. They are reading a story with a clear direction. And unlike court transcripts, this story is not argued by opposing sides. It is assembled collaboratively by the institution itself. There is no dramatic confrontation at this stage. No hearing, no announcement. The inmate may not even realize that their file has crossed an invisible threshold. But once it does, the system's attention shifts from management to placement. The question is no longer how to correct behavior within the current environment. It becomes where that behavior will have the least impact. And that question leads inevitably toward a very short list of facilities. Reviews without a deadline. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the prison transfer process is timing. From the outside, people assume that extreme confinement decisions happen quickly after a major incident, a serious violation, or a sudden breakdown in order. In reality, the opposite is true. The most consequential decisions in the prison system are often the slowest ones, precisely because they are meant to appear inevitable rather than reactive. This chapter focuses on that slow pressure. Once an inmate's file has reached a certain density, thick with observations, assessments, and failed interventions, it enters a review cycle with no fixed endpoint. These reviews do not operate under urgency. There is no countdown, no deadline, and no requirement to resolve the situation quickly. The system is comfortable waiting, because waiting allows patterns to become undeniable. Classification reviews occur periodically, but in cases of concern, those reviews begin to change character. Instead of asking whether custody levels should be adjusted up or down, committees begin asking whether the current category itself is appropriate at all. This is a subtle but powerful shift. The inmate is no longer being measured against others in the same facility. They are being measured against the limits of the system. Each review adds perspective rather than resolution. Committee members examine how previous recommendations played out. Did increased supervision reduce issues? Did transfers within the same security level stabilize behavior? Did new environments produce different outcomes? When the answer keeps coming back negative, the language inside reviews begins to evolve. Phrases like continued concern or no sustained improvement appear. These are not accusations. They are conclusions drawn from time. The longer the record, the harder it becomes to argue that conditions will improve on their own. What makes this stage particularly powerful is that it feels invisible to the person at the center of it. From the inmate's perspective, life may appear unchanged. They follow routine. They receive no formal notice that anything unusual is happening. There is no warning that a larger process is unfolding above them. That absence of feedback is intentional. The system does not want behavior altered for observation. It wants consistency. Behind the scenes, however, reviews are becoming more focused. Psychological input is revisited, not to determine mental illness, but to assess stress tolerance, adaptability, and response to restriction. Security staff weigh institutional impact rather than personal conduct. Administrators examine resource allocation, how much time, attention, and structural adjustment is required to manage one individual. These discussions are not dramatic. They are administrative, but they are decisive. At this level, no one argues that the inmate is bad or beyond help. Instead, the consensus moves toward a quieter conclusion that the standard prison environment is no longer an effective container. This is where escalation becomes procedural rather than emotional. The idea of higher-level placement is introduced cautiously. It may appear as a footnote in a review summary or as a conditional recommendation. If current management strategies remain ineffective, alternative placement may be considered. That sentence does not move anyone overnight, but it changes the direction of the file. Once alternative placement is mentioned, future reviews begin referencing it. Each new assessment is read with that possibility in mind. The question shifts from "is this necessary?" to "is this now justified?" And justification in the prison system is built through repetition. What makes this stage especially powerful is that it creates momentum without motion. Nothing visibly changes, yet the outcome becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. The longer the review cycle continues without improvement, the more the system perceives delay as risk. At some point, stability stops being measured by behavior and starts being measured by containment. This is also where responsibility disperses. No single administrator feels ownership over the final outcome, because each step has been incremental. Every decision can be traced back to a previous recommendation, a previous review, a previous failure to stabilize conditions. The system protects itself by making the process collective. By the time higher-level officials become involved, they are not deciding whether escalation should occur. They are confirming that it already has. The absence of a deadline is not an oversight. It is a strategy. Time turns uncertainty into evidence. Silence turns patterns into conclusions. And patience turns recommendation into policy. By the end of this stage, the file no longer asks for solutions. It asks for placement. And once that question is formally raised, the range of possible answers becomes very small. When containment replaces correction, there is a moment in the prison system when the language of improvement quietly disappears. No memo announces it. No policy explicitly declares it. But inside administrative discussions, a subtle shift occurs, one that changes the purpose of confinement itself. This chapter is about that shift. For most inmates, the system operates on an assumption of adjustability. Behavior can be modified. Compliance can be reinforced. Stability can be restored. Even when discipline is applied, it is framed as corrective, temporary measures meant to realign behavior with institutional expectations. But in certain cases, that assumption erodes. When repeated interventions fail, administrators begin to recognize that they are no longer correcting behavior. They are merely containing it. And containment, unlike correction, has a different objective. Correction asks, how do we change outcomes? Containment asks, how do we limit impact? This distinction matters more than any single incident. At this stage, the system no longer expects improvement. It expects predictability. The priority shifts from guiding behavior to preventing disruption. That shift is not punitive. It is strategic. Institutions are designed to function efficiently. Housing units rely on routine. Staff rotations depend on consistency. Movement schedules assume cooperation. When an inmate consistently forces a system to adapt through resistance, influence, or persistent non-alignment, the cost becomes visible, not in headlines, in staffing hours, in administrative workload, in operational strain. This is when escalation thresholds are crossed. These thresholds are not written as numbers. There is no formal rule that says, after 5 failures, escalate. Instead, escalation emerges from accumulated judgment. Each failed adjustment adds weight to the argument that the current environment is not suited to long-term management. At this point, administrators begin discussing risk in abstract terms. Not immediate danger, not imminent harm, but systemic risk. Risk to staff morale, risk to unit stability, risk to institutional authority. The inmate's behavior may still appear controlled on the surface, but what matters now is sustainability. Can the institution continue operating this way indefinitely? When the answer trends toward no, containment becomes a preferred strategy. This is also when the system begins to think spatially. Instead of asking what rules apply here, administrators ask what environment neutralizes behavior. The focus shifts from policy to architecture, from procedure to structure. This is where extreme confinement enters the conversation. Not as punishment, but as a design solution. Facilities like Supermax prisons are not built to correct behavior. They are built to absorb it, to isolate it, to prevent it from interacting with anything else. That purpose aligns perfectly with the system's needs at this stage. But before such a decision can be made, it must be framed correctly. Administrators do not argue that an inmate deserves harsher treatment. They argue that standard environments are ineffective. They emphasize institutional limits rather than individual faults. This framing is essential because it protects the decision from legal and procedural challenge. Containment is presented as necessity, not judgment. Once this framing is accepted, the process accelerates, not visibly, but structurally. Reviews become shorter. Recommendations become more direct. Language shifts from conditional to declarative. Instead of may require alternative placement, files begin to state, requires a controlled environment beyond current institutional capacity. That sentence carries weight. It signals that the system has stopped experimenting. From this point forward, discussions are no longer about trying new approaches. They are about implementing the only remaining one. What makes this stage particularly final is that it leaves little room for reversal. Correction allows for hope. Containment does not. Once the system decides a behavior must be isolated rather than managed, every subsequent decision supports that conclusion. The inmate does not receive notice of this change in philosophy. There is no explanation delivered. From their perspective, life may feel unchanged, but internally, the decision has already moved beyond debate. Containment has replaced correction, and when that happens, the destination is no longer theoretical. It becomes logistical. The decision that no one announces. By the time an inmate's case reaches this stage, the prison system no longer treats the situation as unresolved. What remains is not debate. It is alignment. This chapter examines a quiet final phase, where multiple branches of the system independently reach the same conclusion, and the transfer becomes a matter of coordination rather than judgment. There is no single meeting where someone declares, this person will be sent to ADX Florence. That moment does not exist. Instead, the decision forms gradually, through parallel agreement. Security staff reach their limits first. Their concern is not personal safety in the immediate sense, but predictability. They document how often procedures must be adjusted, how frequently staff attention is redirected, and how institutional routines bend around one individual. These reports are not emotional. They are operational. Psychological services follow with a different focus. They do not assess guilt or danger. They assess adaptability. How does the inmate respond to restriction? Does increased control stabilize behavior or intensify resistance? Does prolonged monitoring lead compliance, or simply quieter forms of defiance? These assessments rarely contain dramatic language. Instead, they describe plateaus, moments where no further improvement is observed despite consistent intervention. Case managers add another layer. They track long-term placement outcomes. Transfers that should have reduced pressure did not. New environments produce familiar results. Stability, when it appears, proves temporary. Notes begin referencing environment-independent behavior, a phrase that carries enormous weight inside the system. When these perspectives align, something critical happens. The file stops growing outward and starts closing inward. New entries no longer explore alternatives. They confirm conclusions already forming. Each department, independently, begins documenting the same reality. The institution has reached the edge of its capability. This is when responsibility shifts upward. Regional administrators review the case not to challenge a narrative, but to verify that due process has been followed internally. Their role is not to reassess behavior, but to confirm that escalation is justified within policy boundaries. They ask different questions. Were all reasonable options attempted? Were evaluations conducted over sufficient time? Is the documentation consistent across facilities? Can the decision be defended years later if reviewed? These questions are not about the inmate. They are about the system protecting itself. At this level, the discussion is no longer emotional, ethical, or even personal. It is institutional. The priority becomes ensuring that the decision fits within the architecture of federal correctional authority. Once that threshold is crossed, the tone of communication changes. Language becomes definitive. Phrases like continued monitoring recommended disappear. They are replaced with placement determination required. This is not escalation. It is closure. What makes this stage so powerful is its silence. There is no warning given to the inmate. No behavioral target is offered. No opportunity for negotiation. From the system's perspective, that phase already passed. Offering it again would suggest uncertainty. And uncertainty is precisely what the system has eliminated. The inmate may notice subtle changes. Increased documentation. More frequent reviews. A sense of being observed without explanation. But there is no indication of what is coming. Behind the scenes, however, Coordination begins, not movement, preparation. Files are standardized. Summaries are rewritten to ensure clarity. Redundancies are removed. The narrative is tightened so that anyone reviewing it later will reach the same conclusion without external explanation. This is critical, because once the transfer path is activated, the case leaves the hands of the original institution. It must stand on its own. Every word matters. Every phrase must justify not punishment, but necessity. This is why ADX Florence occupies such a unique position in the system. It is not framed as a harsher prison. It is framed as a specialized solution, a place designed for individuals whose presence creates persistent institutional strain regardless of environment. By the time the destination is considered, the decision is no longer about where the inmate will go. It is about acknowledging that there is only one place left that fits the conclusions already reached, and still nothing is announced. No one is informed. No timeline is shared. No paperwork is signed in front of the inmate. The decision exists fully formed, but unspoken. It is embedded in files, reflected in language, and reinforced by consensus. From this point forward, everything that happens is procedural. The judgment is already complete. The system after the decision. By the time the prison system reaches its final conclusion, nothing dramatic remains to be done. No arguments are left unresolved. No alternatives remain unexplored. No uncertainty lingers inside the file. What exists instead is a system that has already moved on. This is one of the most difficult truths to understand about extreme prison transfers. The most consequential moment is never visible. There is no confrontation, no final warning, and no defining incident that the public can point to and say, this is when everything changed. Everything changed long before that. The decision to send someone to the highest level of isolation does not come from fear, anger, or retaliation. It comes from exhaustion, from a system that is documented, reviewed, adjusted, and recalculated until the only remaining option fits the evidence already assembled. By the time that point is reached, the inmate is no longer being evaluated as an individual. They are being understood as a variable the system can no longer absorb. This is what makes the outcome feel inevitable. There is no single person responsible, no single signature that carries blame, no dramatic turning point that could have been reversed. Instead, the system arrives at agreement by removing doubt. Every department sees the same pattern. Every review confirms the same limitation. Every layer of oversight verifies that the process followed policy. And once that consensus exists, the future is quietly decided. What happens next is procedural. Files move, approvals align, logistics prepare. But those steps are no longer meaningful in human terms. The real transfer already occurred, from correction to containment, from adjustment to isolation, from possibility to permanence. This is why facilities like ADX Florence exist, not as symbols of punishment, but as endpoints, places designed not to change behavior, but to prevent it from interacting with anything else. Environments built to remove influence rather than confront it. And once the system commits to that purpose, there is no language left for reconsideration. What makes this reality so unsettling is how ordinary it appears from the outside. There are no alarms, no headlines, no moments of chaos. The machinery continues to operate smoothly, efficiently, and quietly. But for the person at the center of the decision, everything is already narrowed. The future has been reduced to a space designed for separation, a sentence within a sentence, a conclusion reached without confrontation. Understanding this process changes how we think about prisons, punishment, and control. It reveals a system that does not rely on spectacle, but on patience. One that does not need force when documentation is enough. And it reminds us that the most powerful decisions are often the ones no one sees being made. Because once a system decides that containment is the only answer left, there is no return to earlier questions. Only the final outcome remains. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.